For 23 years, I had dreamed of owning my own piece of land. Not just any land, but real ranch property where I could breathe without someone looking over my shoulder, where I could build something with my own hands instead of just drawing plans for other people to build. As a chief civil engineer, I had spent decades designing neighborhoods, planning infrastructure, and supervising construction projects that would house thousands of families. But every night, I would drive home to my small apartment in the city and dream of something different. I wanted space. I wanted freedom. I wanted to wake up to the sound of wind through grass instead of traffic on concrete. I saved every penny I could for 15 years. While my colleagues bought fancy cars and took expensive vacations, I put money aside month after month, building towards something bigger than immediate satisfaction. My coworkers thought I was crazy, living so simply when I made good money, but they did not understand the vision I carried in my heart. Then I found it. 40 acres of perfect ranch land just outside the city limits, complete with an old farmhouse, a weathered red barn, and several outbuildings that had seen better days but still had good bones. The property had been in the same family for generations, and they were finally ready to sell to someone who would appreciate what they were passing on. The day I signed the deed was the most emotional moment of my adult life. Standing on that front porch, holding the keys to my own piece of America, I felt like I had finally made it. This was not just property. This was freedom. This was the reward for all those years of discipline and delayed gratification. Those first few months were pure magic. I would wake up before sunrise and walk my property with a cup of coffee, planning improvements and just soaking in the peace. The old barn creaked in the morning breeze, telling stories of the decades it had sheltered animals and stored hay. The farmhouse needed work, but it had character that no modern construction could match. I spent my weekends fixing fence posts, repairing barn doors, and learning skills my engineering education had never taught me. There is something deeply satisfying about working with your hands, about solving problems with tools instead of computers, about creating something solid and real that will last for generations. The nearest neighbors were about a quarter-mile away in a new housing development that had been built a few years earlier. From my back porch, I could see their neat rows of identical houses with their perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. It looked pleasant enough, though not the kind of life I wanted for myself. I preferred the natural beauty of my ranch, where every tree and rock had its own character. I never imagined that my peaceful sanctuary would become the center of a war I never asked for. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Margaret first appeared at my gate. I was replacing boards on the barn door when I heard the rumble of an expensive SUV coming down my gravel driveway. The white Escalade looked completely out of place against the rustic backdrop of my ranch, like a diamond ring in a toolbox. The woman who stepped out was everything I expected from someone who drove such a vehicle. She was probably in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair that had never seen a day of actual work, wearing clothes that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. Her expression was already set in disapproval before she had even looked around. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that carried the tone of someone used to being obeyed. "I need to speak with the property owner." I set down my hammer and walked over, wiping my hands on my work shirt. "That would be me. How can I help you?" Her eyes swept over my appearance with obvious distaste. "I am Margaret Henderson, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your little hobby farm here." The condescension in her voice was thick enough to spread on toast. Little hobby farm. As if my 40 acres of legitimate ranch property were some kind of children's game. "What seems to be the problem?" I asked, keeping my voice level. The problem is that your activities here are affecting property values in our community. These old buildings are eyesores, and frankly, the whole setup looks unprofessional and inappropriate for this area. I felt my jaw tighten, but I maintained my composure. Ma'am, this is private property, and everything here is completely legal and properly maintained. She laughed, a sharp sound with no humor in it. I am going to need to see some documentation proving that. Property deeds, building permits, the works. And I want to discuss what you plan to do about bringing this place up to appropriate standards for rural residential areas. The audacity took my breath away. This woman was standing on my land, demanding to see my private documents, and telling me how to manage property she had no connection to whatsoever. I do not need to provide you with anything, I said firmly. This property is mine, free and clear, and has been for months. Your HOA has no authority here. Her perfectly penciled eyebrows shot up. We will see about that. I know all about property rights and community standards. I have been dealing with situations like this for years. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my barn, my house, and my fence line. I am documenting everything. Height violations, structural concerns, aesthetic impacts on neighboring properties. You are going to be hearing from code enforcement very soon. You are welcome to contact anyone you want, I replied. They will tell you exactly what I am telling you. This is private property, properly owned and maintained. Margaret put her phone away and fixed me with a stare that was probably meant to be intimidating. This is not over. I have resources and connections that you clearly do not understand. I suggest you start thinking about what kind of neighbor you want to be. She climbed back into her SUV and slammed the door hard enough to make her point. As she drove away, kicking up gravel and dust, I watched her perfectly manicured fingers drumming on the steering wheel. Through the rear window, I could see her already making phone calls. Standing there in the settling dust, I realized that my peaceful ranch life had just come to an end. This woman had declared war on me for the crime of owning property she did not approve of. I had no idea how far she was willing to take this fight, but something in her eyes told me I was about to find out. The storm clouds were gathering, and I was about to learn just how nasty people can get when they think they have power over you. The harassment started the very next day. I came home from work to find an official-looking envelope in my mailbox with the county logo on it. Inside was a complaint form alleging violations of rural zoning standards, signed by Margaret Henderson and filed with the Code Enforcement Office. The accusations were ridiculous. She claimed my barn was too close to the property line, which was false. She said my fencing was not up to county standards, which was also false. She even complained that the color of my barn was not appropriate for rural residential areas. Apparently, the red paint that had been there for decades was suddenly a threat to community values. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 7 more complaints, each one more petty than the last. The height of my fence posts, the placement of my mailbox, the fact that I had farm equipment visible from the road. Margaret was apparently spending her days finding new things to complain about. The code enforcement officers were apologetic but professional. They had to investigate every complaint, even the obviously frivolous ones. Officer Martinez showed up for the 3rd time in 10 days, looking embarrassed as he explained that someone had complained about my gravel driveway creating dust clouds. "Look, sir," he said quietly, "between you and me, these complaints are getting out of hand. Everything here is completely legal and well-maintained, but I have to respond to every formal complaint that gets filed." I understand you are just doing your job, I replied. But this is harassment, plain and simple. He nodded sympathetically. I know. I see it all the time in HOA disputes. Unfortunately, unless someone crosses a clear legal line, there is not much we can do to stop frivolous complaints. As Officer Martinez drove away, I noticed a white SUV parked on the public road about 100 yards from my gate. Margaret was sitting there with what looked like a professional camera, documenting his visit. She was building some kind of case, collecting evidence of official visits to make it look like my property was actually problematic. The next week brought a new level of escalation. Margaret had apparently been organizing neighborhood meetings to discuss what she called the ranch problem. I found out about this when my neighbor Tom stopped by to apologize. "Hey, buddy," Tom said, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted you to know that Margaret woman has been going around to all the houses, trying to get people worked up about your place. She is saying you are bringing down property values and that the county is investigating you for multiple violations." "None of that is true," I said. "I know that. Anyone with eyes can see your place is well maintained, but she has got some people convinced. She is organized, I will give her that. Professional presentations, printed materials, the whole 9 yards. Tom handed me a flyer that Margaret had been distributing. It was titled, "Protecting Our Community Standards," and featured photos of my property taken from the road. The pictures were shot from unflattering angles and cropped to make everything look as shabby as possible. My beautiful old barn looked like a condemned building in her propaganda. "She is calling it a rural standards enforcement initiative," Tom continued, "making it sound like she is protecting everyone from some kind of threat. Most of us know better, but a few people are starting to buy into it." That night, I made a decision that would prove crucial later. I started documenting everything. Every complaint, every official visit, every interaction with Margaret. I bought a security camera system and installed it around my property. If this woman wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I had evidence of every move she made. The harassment was taking its toll. I found myself dreading coming home, wondering what new complaint would be waiting in my mailbox. The peaceful sanctuary I had worked so hard to create was becoming a battlefield. Every morning when I walked my property with my coffee, I found myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if Margaret was out there somewhere with her camera. But I was also getting angry, really angry. This woman had no right to do this to me. I had worked hard, played by the rules, and bought my piece of the American dream fair and square. Nobody was going to take that away from me through intimidation and harassment. I just had no idea how far Margaret was willing to go to get what she wanted. The worst was yet to come. 3 weeks into Margaret's campaign against me, she made the accusation that changed everything. I was working in my garden on a Saturday morning when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the county sheriff's office. "Mr. Davidson, this is Deputy Williams. We have received a report of possible property theft at your address. We need to come out and investigate." My blood went cold. "Property theft? What are you talking about?" "Ma'am says you have stolen buildings and structures that belong to the previous property owner. She claims to have evidence. We will be there in about 20 minutes. I hung up the phone in shock. Stolen buildings. The barn and outbuildings had been part of the property when I bought it. They were included in the deed, inspected by the bank, and covered by my insurance. The idea that I had somehow stolen structures that weighed tons and were permanently attached to foundations was beyond absurd. But Margaret had made the call, and now I was going to be treated like a criminal on my own land. 20 minutes later, 3 sheriff's vehicles pulled into my driveway, followed by Margaret's white SUV. She climbed out looking like she had just won the lottery, practically vibrating with excitement as she pointed toward my barn. Officers, those buildings were not here when this property was sold. I have photographs from the real estate listing, and I can prove that structures have been added illegally. This man has stolen property from somewhere and moved it here. Deputy Williams, a tall man in his 40s with the tired expression of someone who had seen every kind of human stupidity, looked from Margaret to me. "Sir, do you have documentation showing ownership of these structures?" "Of course I do," I said, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. "These buildings have been here for decades. They were part of the property when I purchased it." "He is lying," Margaret interjected. "I have proof. Show them the photographs, deputy. The buildings in the original listing photos are completely different from what is here now." I watched in disbelief as Margaret produced a folder full of printed photographs. She had apparently found old real estate photos from previous sales of the property going back years, and was claiming that differences in photo angles and lighting proved that buildings had been moved or replaced. "Ma'am," Deputy Williams said patiently, "these photos appear to show the same structures from different angles and at different times of year. I do not see evidence of theft here." But Margaret was not backing down. "Look at this barn," she insisted. "The color is different. The doors are different. He has obviously replaced the original buildings with stolen ones. I want him arrested for grand theft." The humiliation was crushing. Here I was, a respected professional who had never committed so much as a traffic violation, being accused of stealing entire buildings. The other deputies were taking notes, treating this like a legitimate investigation because that was their job, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. "Sir, I am going to need to see your property documentation," Deputy Williams said. "Deed survey, any building permits or inspection records." I went into the house and retrieved my property file. Everything was there. The deed clearly describing all structures on the property, survey maps showing building locations, insurance appraisals listing every structure, purchase agreements including all buildings and improvements. As I handed over the documents, Margaret continued her performance. "He probably forged those documents, or he paid off the previous owner to lie about what was included in the sale. I know property theft when I see it." Deputy Williams spent 15 minutes reviewing my paperwork while Margaret paced around pointing at different buildings and making increasingly wild claims. She suggested that I had somehow moved my farmhouse from another location. She claimed that my fence posts had been stolen from a construction site. She even accused me of stealing the gravel in my driveway. The other officers were starting to exchange glances. Margaret's accusations were becoming so outlandish that even protocol-bound law enforcement was beginning to recognize they were dealing with someone who had lost touch with reality. But the damage was done. I was standing on my own property, having to prove my innocence to police officers who had been told I was a criminal. The woman who had made these accusations was watching with satisfaction, as I was forced to defend myself against charges that never should have been taken seriously. Margaret had crossed a line that I never thought anyone would cross. She had weaponized law enforcement against me, using false accusations to try to terrorize me into submission. As I watched her smug expression while deputies examined my legal documents, I realized that this fight had moved far beyond harassment. This was war. Deputy Williams finished reviewing my documentation and looked up with an expression that was becoming increasingly skeptical of Margaret's claims. The paperwork was ironclad. Every building, every structure, Every improvement on the property was clearly documented and legally owned. "Ma'am," he said to Margaret, "these documents appear to be in order. The property deed specifically includes all buildings and structures. The survey matches what we see here. I am not seeing evidence of theft." Margaret's confident demeanor began to crack. "But the photographs," she insisted. "The buildings are different, the colors are wrong, something has been changed." "Buildings get painted," Deputy Williams replied patiently. "Doors get replaced. Normal maintenance does not constitute theft." I watched Margaret's face as reality started to penetrate her fantasy. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her accusations. "Then he must have bribed the previous owner," she declared, "or intimidated them into including buildings that were not supposed to be part of the sale. I know what I saw in those original photos." Deputy Williams closed my file and handed it back to me. "Sir, everything appears to be legitimate here. Your ownership is well documented." He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, making false reports to law enforcement is a serious matter. Are you certain about these allegations?" The question hung in the air like a threat. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Margaret looked uncertain. But she was in too deep to stop now. "I am certain that something is wrong here," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "Maybe I need to do more research, but I know that man is up to something illegal." That was when I decided to reveal something I had been keeping to myself. "Officers, there is something you should know about my professional background. I am a licensed civil engineer with over 20 years of experience in construction and development." Deputy Williams raised an eyebrow. "What kind of development work?" "Residential and commercial construction, subdivision planning, infrastructure design. I have supervised the construction of thousands of homes and dozens of commercial projects throughout this region." The shift in the officer's attitude was immediate and noticeable. They were no longer dealing with a simple property dispute between neighbors. They were dealing with someone who understood construction, zoning, and property law better than most people in the county. "I see," Deputy Williams said slowly. "So you would be familiar with building codes, permit requirements, property documentation." "Very familiar," I confirmed. "I have been working with these systems for my entire career. I would never violate construction codes or property laws. My professional license depends on it." Margaret was starting to look panicked. The narrative she had constructed was falling apart as the officers realized they were dealing with a trained professional, not some ignorant property owner who might actually commit the crimes she was alleging. "Ma'am," Deputy Williams said to Margaret, "you are accusing a licensed civil engineer of stealing buildings and placing them illegally on his own property. Do you understand how that sounds?" I do not care what his job is," Margaret stammered. "Wrong is wrong. If he did something illegal, his profession does not matter." But her confidence was completely gone now. She was grasping for any argument that might salvage her position, but the officers were clearly losing patience with her claims. "Sir," Deputy Williams said to me, "have you had any other issues with this lady? Any pattern of complaints or harassment?" This was the opening I had been waiting for. "Yes, officer. She has filed numerous false complaints with code enforcement over the past month. I have documentation of every incident." I showed them copies of all the bogus complaints Margaret had filed, along with the reports from code enforcement officers who had found no violations. The pattern of harassment was clear and well documented. Deputy Williams studied the paperwork with growing interest. "This is quite a pattern," he observed. "Multiple complaints, all unfounded, all from the same person." Margaret was beginning to realize that her harassment campaign was about to backfire spectacularly, but she had no idea how spectacularly. I still had one more card to play, and it was going to change everything. I looked at Deputy Williams and made a decision that would end this harassment once and for all. Officer, there is one more thing you need to know about my background. I was the chief engineer who designed and supervised the construction of Meadowbrook Hills. The silence that followed was deafening. Deputy Williams stared at me, then at Margaret, then back at me. The other officers stopped writing in their notebooks and looked up with expressions of complete disbelief. "You design what now?" Deputy Williams asked slowly. "Meadowbrook Hills. The entire HOA development where Margaret lives. Every house, every street, every utility line, every storm drain. I spent 2 years planning that community and another 3 years supervising its construction." Margaret's face went through a series of color changes that would have been comical if the situation were not so serious. First pale, then red, then a sickly green as the full implications hit her. "That is impossible," she whispered. "No, ma'am, it is not impossible. It is documented fact. I have the original blueprints, construction contracts, and supervision reports for every phase of that development. Your house at 428 Elm Street sits on Lot 17 of Phase 2. It has a modified Charleston floor plan with an extended master suite. The foundation was poured on March 15, 2019. I was there to inspect it personally." Deputy Williams was struggling not to smile. "So you are telling me that this lady has been harassing the man who built her neighborhood?" "That is exactly what I am telling you. Furthermore, my ranch property predates her development by over 40 years. I was here first, in every sense that matters. The original survey for Meadowbrook Hills specifically notes the existing ranch property as a permanent boundary marker." Margaret was making small choking sounds as she tried to process what she was hearing. The woman who had been lecturing me about property values and community standards had been attacking the very person who created her precious community. "This has to be a lie," she managed to say. "He is making this up to get out of trouble." "Officer," I said calmly, "I can provide you with construction contracts, engineering stamps, city permits, and inspection reports that prove every word I have said. My name is on the official city records as the chief engineer for that entire project." Deputy Williams was now openly grinning. "Ma'am, do you understand what you have done here? You have been filing false reports against the man who designed your house." The other officers were trying to maintain professional composure, but I could see them fighting back laughter. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "He built every pipe in your plumbing system," Deputy Williams continued. "Every wire in your electrical system, every street you drive on to get home, and you called us to report him for property theft." Margaret was hyperventilating now. "This cannot be happening. This cannot be real." "It gets better," I said. "The reason I bought this ranch property is because I fell in love with it during the surveying phase of your development. I spent months walking this land, taking measurements and soil samples for the engineering study. I knew every inch of this property before the first house in your neighborhood was even planned." Deputy Williams closed his notebook and looked at Margaret with something approaching pity. "Ma'am, filing false reports with law enforcement is a misdemeanor offense. Given the pattern of harassment we have documented here, the district attorney might be interested in pursuing charges." The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had completely reversed. Margaret was no longer the authority figure trying to control an unruly neighbor. She was a foolish woman who had attacked someone far more qualified, knowledgeable, and connected than she could have imagined. "Officer," I said, "I want to press charges for filing false reports and for harassment. This woman has made my life miserable for weeks with her bogus complaints and accusations. It needs to stop." Margaret's legs buckled, and she had to lean against her SUV for support. The realization of what she had done and what it was going to cost her was finally sinking in. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was standing right here in my driveway, wearing a sheriff's badge and taking notes. The aftermath of Margaret's spectacular miscalculation was swift and satisfying. Deputy Williams spent another 20 minutes taking my statement about the weeks of harassment, documenting every false complaint and bogus accusation. Margaret stood by her SUV in stunned silence, finally understanding that her campaign of intimidation had backfired completely. "Ma'am," Deputy Williams said to her, "you are looking at potential charges for filing false reports, harassment, and misuse of emergency services. The district attorney takes these things seriously, especially when there is a clear pattern of abuse." Margaret finally found her voice, but it was weak and desperate. I made a mistake. I did not know who he was. Maybe we can work something out. Maybe we can forget this whole thing happened." "That is not how the law works," Deputy Williams replied. "You cannot file false police reports and then apologize your way out of consequences when you get caught." As the officers prepared to leave, they handed me case numbers for the incident reports and assured me that the district attorney would be in touch about pressing charges. Margaret climbed into her SUV and drove away without another word, but not before I saw tears of humiliation streaming down her perfectly made-up face. The story spread through both communities like wildfire. Within days, everyone in Meadowbrook Hills knew that their HOA president had been harassing the engineer who built their neighborhood. The irony was too delicious for people to keep to themselves. Tom stopped by the next evening with updates. "You should see the neighborhood chat groups," he said, grinning. "Margaret has become a laughingstock. People are calling her the Karen who attacked her own creator. She has not been seen outside her house since yesterday." The formal consequences came quickly. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Margaret as president. Several neighbors who had supported her harassment campaign were now embarrassed and eager to distance themselves from her actions. Margaret never did face criminal charges. After her lawyer explained the strength of the case against her, she agreed to a settlement that included a formal apology, reimbursement for my legal expenses, and a legally binding agreement never to contact me or file complaints about my property again. 3 months later, Margaret quietly moved away from Meadowbrook Hills. Word was that she could not handle the embarrassment of living in a community where everyone knew about her epic failure. Her house sold quickly, probably because buyers were eager to live in a development designed by someone with my reputation and credentials. My ranch life returned to the peace I had originally sought. The harassment stopped completely, and my relationship with the remaining neighbors actually improved. Several of them stopped by to apologize for not speaking up sooner against Margaret's campaign. As I sit on my porch now, watching the sunset over my 40 acres of freedom, I reflect on the lessons learned. Bullies depend on their victims being weak and isolated. They assume that aggression and persistence will eventually wear down opposition. Margaret made the fatal error of assuming she was dealing with someone who could be intimidated. Property rights matter, respect matters, and sometimes justice comes in the form of watching someone's arrogance destroy them when they pick the wrong target. Margaret learned the hard way that you should always know who you are dealing with before you declare war on them. My ranch remains my sanctuary, just as I always dreamed it would be.